This tutorial is going to demonstrate some techniques for using realistic trees in your Photoshop site plan renderings. What I'm going to do is bring in a few trees into this drawing and replace the tree line work that I have from AutoCAD with some realistic tree symbols. I've got a few here, and the first step is to say Control A or Command A on my Mac, Command C, and then come back to this rendering and Command V. I'm going to put this tree just sort of temporarily in the middle of this rendering. We'll do that with a couple other trees that I have that are already cut out. In this case, if you were to do Control A, Control C, and then come here and Control V, you'd actually grab the black background with it. And you might think you need to wand that out, but what we're going to do in this case is actually, in many cases like this, the channels themselves will have an alpha channel. We'll be able to control click on that alpha channel, and it puts a marquee around our selection here. What's great is that I even find some of the more nuanced holes in this tree. We'll come back to our layer, click on the background, and say Command C, come back to our rendering, and Command V. Move this one off to the side as well, and then come back to my third tree. Same alpha channel here, control click on the channel, come back to the layer, Control C, and Control V. So we've got three different trees into our rendering, and we might think, great, now's the time to start distributing these across the site. I want to do two things first. The first one's very simple. We're going to rename the trees just so we can keep them in order. We'll call it Tree 1, Tree 2, and Tree 3. The second thing we want to do is make them feel like they came from the same environment. As you can see here, I've chosen three distinct trees that have very different color effects. They don't really jive with each other, and let alone the rest of the rendering. So we're going to have to make some adjustments to these trees to kind of get a cohesion of colors here. We've got this one that has more of a cooler color. This one has more of a warmer color. This one is very much desaturated. We're going to have to play with the levels and curves to sort of bring some of the life back to this particular tree. We'll do them individually, but I like keeping them next to each other so that we can see how those changes are being made and if they are starting to build some cohesion. So I'm going to grab this. I can, with my move tool, right click on it, go to this tree 1 layer. I'm going to Control T this up just a little bit so I can get them roughly the same size. I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Hue and Saturation. We'll tinker with this one first, and I might bump up the saturation a little bit to bring a little bit of the color back and turn the lightness down a touch. I'll also come to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and begin to move the sliders around just a little bit to, again, just restore a little bit of the color here. We might also do a couple more adjustments. We'll go to Image and Photo Filter, and in this case what I'm going to do is, instead of putting a warming filter, I'm going to put a cooling filter and see if I can get it a little bluer in here. You might continue to make some adjustments to these trees. Now once we feel good about the adjustments, what we might do is take these trees and move them off to the side of our drawing. We'll do that here. We want to move it in an area where we can just grab these trees and pull them into our drawing without actually having them on top of where we want to put the trees currently. This will just give us something to pull from, and we can take this tree, displace it in a couple different areas across our site, and this will always be the one that we copy from. Now before we start to copy, we might do a couple additional effects to the tree. We could play with the curves, play with the levels to get the lighting just right. These trees seem a little dark, but what I'm probably going to do is later on in the drawing actually turn the opacity down on these trees. That'll help to lighten them up. One thing that's always really helpful is to control click on the layer. You'll see that it'll put an outline around this tree. Currently it has a very hard edge to it, and it's because it's a photograph, and it has full pixels right here, and then right on the outside there are no pixels. What we can do is, after we control click on the icon, we can go to Select and Feather. We'll do that under Modify and Feather. What this will do is it'll actually soften the edge right here, or at least soften the selection initially. We'll change the feather radius to somewhere between 3 and 5. We'll leave it at 4 for now. And what it does is it will just soften the selection edge. I'll then inverse the selection right here And so now our selection is actually outside of it, and we'll just tap delete. What this does, and it's very subtle, what it does is it actually softens that edge. You can see as I hit delete a few more times, it just continues to ghost that edge. And what we do is we get a little softer feel. It feels like the edges of our tree is a little airier right in here. We might back up just a little bit. Control click our layer again, say select, modify, feather, choose a slightly higher radius. We'll try 8 this time. Inverse the selection through select inverse and hit delete. And you can see that it is just kind of softening that edge. That's a nice effect that helps, especially if you cut out trees and you have that white glowing outline to it. This is a perfect way to get rid of that. We'll do this to the other trees as well. Now at this point, we're ready to move these trees to different spots on the site. I'm going to grab tree 3 right here. And instead of moving this direct one, I'm just going to hold down Option on my Mac, or it's Alt on a PC. We're going to drag this tree over and then Control T to resize the tree to roughly the size that you need. I'll then hold down Alt again with my Move tool, and I'll move this tree. Just so I don't get the exact same tree in the same orientation 3 different times, make it look exactly like I've tiled this, what I'm going to do is back up a couple steps. And each time I grab this tree, I'm just going to rotate it slightly, might even make it a little bit larger, and move it. Now if I wanted to take it a step further, I might grab the clone stamp tool and begin to stamp some brushes, some of the branches to add new branches, grab my eraser, erase a few of the branches. In this case, a heavy overlap of this tree and changing the size via transform should be enough, at least in these 4 trees right here. Now, as you can see, we have tree 3, which is our original tree, and then we have these 4 copies right here that become our trees. We'll continue this process for all of the trees across the site. Continue to move these, hold down Option on Mac, rotate these trees a little bit. Now, some trees that you bring in are already going to have a naturally shaded edge, and so you don't want to deviate too much from that. You can see my building shadows are going to the bottom left. So what I'm going to do is kind of rotate these a little closer to that general area. We're going to fake in a shadow on these in just a second, but more or less want to stick to what the shading on this natural tree, or on this tree, is actually doing naturally. We continue to move these trees around the site. By the end of this, you're going to have a lot of different layers, and there's a bunch of techniques for doing this. Some people like to put all these layers or the different trees in folders so that they can organize them that way, and that's perfectly fine. I'll grab tree 3 and I'll just click on a folder icon and we'll put them in one group right here. I'll do the same thing for all the tree 2s right here, put them in a group. And that might be a good way to organize this. Eventually you'll get all these trees around here, and instead of going and individually putting a drop shadow on each of the trees, you'll want to actually do a drop shadow for all of them together. What I'm going to do is do an extra step in conjunction with the drop shadow. Well, the first step will simply be to turn off the trees that were the template trees to begin with. And then I'm going to grab all of my trees in my scene and merge them together. To merge them, if they're in a group, you might create just a dummy layer up top, which is just a blank layer altogether. Highlight all of them, and Command E or Control E on a PC is to merge all those layers. You could also just right click and go to merge layers. I'm going to do Command E, and it's going to merge all these into a single layer. Now, once you've done that, there's no going back and actually moving the trees around. And so in fact, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll duplicate all of these trees, or these groups right here, so that you can have 2 versions of them. One that you're going to merge into a single layer, but you still have all the originals. What I'll typically do is I might grab a group, right click on this group, and duplicate the group, but not duplicate it into my drawing. I'll duplicate it into a new drawing so that they'll plop in right here, and if I ever need to come back and save them, I'll have a separate PSD file. What this is going to do is just going to help my PSD file from not getting too heavy. If you feel like this is the end of your project and you're ready to finalize things, you might just duplicate it into its own drawing instead of having a completely separate drawing. I just do it for saving space inside my Photoshop files. So what I'm going to do again is merge these into a single layer. Hopefully we've duplicated them or have some backup option if we need to come and change these things. Now, you'll often see this. I'm going to call it all trees. A good technique to get that sort of consistent darker edge of the tree and maybe a consistent brighter edge of a tree is to create a new layer. And we'll call this all tree shading, because that's essentially what we're going to do here. We'll control click on all the trees right here. We might come back with a green brush. Let's try and find some color green that's from this. Might grab a brush in here. I'm just going to grab one of my basic soft brushes. We'll go with a soft round. And I'm just going to click in on the bottom side. Now you can see I'm painting with this lighter color. But once I multiply this, you're going to see that it's going to darken up that side of the tree. And you might just shade in on these trees to darken up the edge on this bottom side. I'll continue to click around and maybe do that for the entire drawing. I'll then create a new layer and we'll call it all tree highlights. And I can take that exact same approach. In this case, I'm actually going to grab maybe more of a yellow color. That becomes my highlight, a yellow-green. And with the same process of control clicking on the layer, I'm going to start to paint some highlights on the top side of these trees right here. Now, instead of doing multiply, because that would more or less take the color away, I'm going to do screen. And what this is going to do is highlight that. Now, it's obviously too strong, so I'll turn down the opacity. But you can see that what it's doing is creating a little bit of a highlight on the front side of those trees. I'll come back and do a little bit of that here. Now you might try different brushes or different approaches, but ultimately what you're trying to do is create a similar lighting system across all of the trees. One of the biggest things that you'll see when people use realistic trees in their drawing is that they're pulling trees from a bunch of different sources with a bunch of different lighting effects, and you're just getting very inconsistent approaches. And these two layers will help to build some consistency in there. Once I've done this, I might come back to my all trees right here. We're going to go to blending options and we're going to create a drop shadow. I'm just going to drag this drop shadow down in the scenes. One of my favorite things about drop shadow is you can drag it this direction. Now, if you further wanted to, create the bevel and emboss or the highlights and the shadow side, you could use bevel and emboss in this case. I'm going to click on bevel and emboss, but in this case, I'm going to change the highlight colors again to kind of a green highlight and the shadow to a darker green as well. You might play with a few different approaches to how this is going to work, and of course, ramp the depth up, modify the size. You can sort of watch and see how it's going to change this stuff in the scene. So you've created drop shadows for all of your trees on one single layer. If you were to do it individually, what you'd find is that this tree might be casting a shadow on this tree, and this tree might be casting a shadow on this tree. It makes it feel like you have one tree that's much taller than the others. Now, this all tree approach is still pretty heavy, so what's nice is I'm going to turn down the opacity on these trees. Turning down the opacity turns down the opacity of the shadow as well, so I might play with turning down the fill, which keeps the intensity of the shadow, and come to a different approach there, and obviously turning off the tree line work after the fact. But you can see this is an approach to start to build your trees in over here. Now, I've already finished out this drawing, added in a few more trees, and changed the opacity. I like these colors a lot better. I think these colors got way too warm. The highlights are really strong, and I certainly want to turn those down a little bit more in here. But I like the coolness of these colors. What I've got, again, is just the all trees that has just the trees as they're distributed across the site. This is them at 100%. In this case, I merged the shadow side on these on the bottom side of these trees with this trees layer right here. Then turn on the bevel and emboss and drop shadow and turn down the opacity to around 70. Now I've done some additional adjustment layers on top, which I think help. Playing with the curves will brighten up the brights and darken up the darks as well. Adjusting the hue and saturation in this case just a little bit and even adding a photo filter, which in this case gives it a hint of warmer. I felt like it tied it into the drawing altogether. And these same adjustment layers right here that are attached to the layer by clicking on this button right here in our adjustment layer properties attaches it to just the trees layer. You can do these same curve effects by just going to image adjustments and playing with the levels and curves and hue and saturation, even the photo filter here. What that does is does it permanently. This just allows me to turn it on and off, and maybe what's even better is I can control the opacity, which controls the intensity of what these adjustment layers are doing. Done the same thing right here. Adjustment layers, if you don't click this button, it means that it applies to every layer below. And in this case, this is the final adjustments that I'm going to make to this rendering, and it's going to affect all the colors in here. So I'll turn on a hue and saturation, which brightens them up a little bit, a photo filter, which warms it, and then adjusting the levels just to brighten it up one last time. So in conclusion, the approach to putting in trees is one, to make sure that you get them in a consistent color palette, that you do some tweaks right up front with those trees, that you merge them all onto one layer so that you can darken them all up together on the bottom side and highlight them all on the top side based on your lighting system. It builds cohesion amongst all your trees in addition to making them feel like they're from the same color palette. Then obviously merging them all into the same layer, you put a drop shadow onto it and then make some final adjustments. So I hope these tips will be helpful as you are putting in realistic trees in your drawings. Know that it is one of the more difficult tasks to really nail and get right in Photoshop, but when it does work, it feels like it can be a pretty helpful rendering technique for your site plans.